Millionaire ignores poor woman on Christmas Eve. But what happens next will change everything. He was rich, she was poor. On Christmas Eve, he ignored her. But what happened next? Unexpected. Get ready for the impossible. Gabriel's phone buzzed on his desk for the 5th time that hour. He didn't answer. His office was sleek, modern, everything a man like him could need. He adjusted his cufflinks, glancing at the clock. Another meeting was approaching, but for Gabriel, time was a resource that needed to be spent wisely, and today, it was running out. The phone buzzed again. Another email from his assistant about the charity event. The gala was just hours away, and Gabriel still hadn't figured out what he was going to say on stage. Not that it mattered. His role was simple. Show up, smile for the cameras, donate the amount they expected, and leave. It was a performance, and he was the lead actor. But the pressure was mounting. His reputation was on the line. His company's success, his life's success, depended on maintaining an image of wealth, influence, and generosity. There was no room for real emotions, no time for empathy. A knock on the door broke his train of thought. His assistant, Jamie, poked her head in. "Gabriel, everything's set for tonight. The mayor is confirmed. The press will be there. You're good to go." "Thanks," he muttered, barely looking up from his laptop. He hadn't noticed the slight frown on Jamie's face or how she hesitated at the door, probably wondering if he ever looked up from work long enough to care about anything else. He'd forgotten her birthday last week, but he wasn't worried about it. She'd probably forgotten his too, and anyway, he was too busy. There was no time for small gestures. Not with the city's elite depending on him to maintain the facade of generosity. The charity, the gala, it was just a game, and Gabriel played it well. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a reminder to pick up his custom-tailored suit for the gala. Gabriel sighed. He didn't care about the gala. He didn't care about the cause either. But if he didn't go, if he didn't present himself as the kind of man who cared, the deals would stop coming. And without the deals, the empire he'd built would crumble. He slammed the laptop shut, stood, and grabbed his coat from the back of the chair. The buzz of the office was now muted as he headed toward the elevator. People rushed past him, their faces lit by the glow of their smartphones, lost in their own worlds. Gabriel didn't notice them. They weren't important to him. In his world, it was all about making the right connections, about climbing higher and higher. He was at the top, and everyone else? They were simply part of the scenery. As he stepped into the elevator, he checked his watch again, impatient. It was almost time to go, but something lingered in the back of his mind. A nagging thought that he couldn't quite shake. The sound of children laughing, the sight of families coming together for Christmas. Things he had long stopped caring about. It had been years since he spent Christmas with anyone other than colleagues or clients. He didn't have time for family, not with the constant grind of the business world. The elevator doors slid open, and Gabriel stepped into the lobby, quickly heading for the exit. He was still lost in his thoughts when he saw her, a woman standing on the sidewalk outside his building, handing out small trinkets to passersby. Her hands were rough, her clothes simple, and there was something about her that caught his attention. But it wasn't enough to make him stop. Without hesitation, Gabriel walked past her, his shoes clicking on the pavement, his mind already racing toward the next task. She wasn't part of his world, and he had no interest in her. To him, she was just another face in the crowd. Mary watched him go. She had seen men like him before, distracted, powerful, and blind to the world outside their ivory towers. She didn't care much about people like him either. She had enough problems of her own, but as she continued to hand out her small ornaments to people walking by, she couldn't help but wonder who he was, and why he looked so empty. Mary's hands ached from the cold, but she ignored it. She had to make enough money today to buy Stephanie a gift. A real one, not the cheap plastic toys she could usually afford. This year, her daughter deserved something special. Maybe a doll, maybe something she could hold on to. But it was hard. It was always hard. Each day felt like a battle just to make it through. She smiled at the people who passed by, offering them her handmade ornaments, but most just ignored her or shook their heads. It didn't matter. She had learned long ago that if you didn't keep moving forward, you'd get left behind. She watched as the man in the expensive suit turned the corner and disappeared into the sea of people. He didn't even look back. To him, she was invisible. She didn't belong to his world, and that was fine. Mary had her own world. One where the only thing that mattered was getting through the day and making sure Stephanie had something to smile about. But as the cold wind blew across the city, Mary couldn't help but think of what it might be like to be in Gabriel's shoes. To live without worrying where the next meal would come from. To live without the weight of responsibility pressing down on her every single day. Would that life make her happy? Would it be enough? The cold wind stung Mary's face as she tucked her hands deeper into her coat pockets. It had been a long day. She had sold just a handful of ornaments, most of which went to people who barely spared a glance at her before moving on. She didn't mind. It wasn't the money that mattered, not really. It was the hope. The hope that something, anything would be different this Christmas. Her daughter Stephanie was waiting at home. She had already told her that Santa might not come this year. It wasn't a lie. Mary had tried to make it sound light, a part of growing up, but deep down, it broke her heart. Stephanie, at 9 years old, still believed in magic. In fairness, Mary wanted to believe too, believe that this Christmas could be different. That somehow, this year, a miracle would happen. But it wasn't likely. No, reality was far harsher. Mary knew the numbers. Rent was due, bills were overdue, and there was no one to help. Her husband, Diego, had been out of work for months. He was always looking for a new job, but nothing seemed to stick. His last attempt at starting a small business had failed miserably, and the weight of that failure was eating away at him, even when he tried to hide it. Mary tried not to think about the tension between them. She could feel it in the air every time she walked into the house. Diego was a good man, she knew that. But his pride was breaking him, and in the process, it was breaking them. She hadn't seen Diego all day. He was probably at the bar again, drowning his frustrations. It wasn't the first time. It hurt to think about, but it wasn't anything new. When times got tough, Diego tended to retreat into the numbness of alcohol. It wasn't the solution, but in his mind, it was the only escape he had left. Mary shook her head. She didn't have the luxury of escape. Her only focus was Stephanie, making sure she had something to open under the tree, no matter how small. The small trinkets she had made and sold on the street were barely enough to scrape by, but they were hers. Every ornament she handed over, every smile she offered to a stranger, was her silent promise to Stephanie that she wasn't giving up. The wind picked up again as she made her way to the bus stop. She rubbed her arms for warmth, her feet aching in the worn shoes that had seen better days. Just as she was about to step onto the bus, a figure caught her eye across the street. It was him, Gabriel, the man from earlier. He was stepping into a black limousine, his face hidden behind a pair of dark sunglasses, his coat billowing behind him. For a brief moment, she thought about calling out to him, asking him for help. She didn't know why, but something about the way he moved, the way he seemed so detached from the world around him, made her wonder if he even noticed people like her. People who worked in the cold, people who fought for every penny. But the thought passed quickly. What was the point? He wouldn't stop. And if he did, what would she even say? Mary climbed onto the bus, squeezing into an empty seat by the window. She watched as Gabriel's limo pulled away, its sleek black exterior gleaming under the city lights. She wondered, for the briefest second, if he ever wondered about people like her. People who lived in the shadows of his world. But deep down, she knew better. People like Gabriel didn't have the time to wonder about people like her. He had his own world to worry about, his own problems. And she was just another face in the crowd. She turned away from the window and closed her eyes, trying to push the thoughts aside. The bus rumbled on, taking her back to the small apartment she shared with Stephanie and Diego. As much as she wanted to escape, she couldn't. She had to face the reality waiting for her at home. She had to hold it all together for Stephanie's sake. Stephanie was the reason she kept going. She was the light in all the darkness, the reason Mary could still find joy in the smallest of things. But as the bus moved through the streets, Mary felt a pang of guilt. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending that everything was okay. When Mary finally arrived home, it was already dark. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater. Stephanie was sitting at the kitchen table, scribbling on a piece of paper with a crayon. When she saw her mother, her face lit up. "Mama, look, I made a picture for you," Stephanie held up the drawing, beaming. It was a simple picture of a house with a tree outside and a tiny figure inside, drawn with bright, colorful crayons. Mary smiled, her heart aching. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "Thank you." Stephanie ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her neck. "Are we going to put up the tree tomorrow? Can we hang up the ornaments you made? I can't wait to see them." Mary felt a lump in her throat. Stephanie was so full of hope, so full of joy. She deserved the world. And here Mary was, struggling to give her even the smallest piece of it. "Yes, baby. We'll put it up tomorrow," she promised, brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead. "We'll make it special." But deep down, she knew that promises like that were becoming harder to keep. The night felt colder as Mary lay in bed, listening to the faint sounds of the city outside their small apartment. Stephanie had fallen asleep early, exhausted from her day at school, and Diego had yet to come home. Mary closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Her mind was racing, overwhelmed by the weight of everything. The bills, the worry, the guilt. She reached over to her nightstand and picked up the crumpled note that had been sitting there for days. It was a letter from the landlord. Rent was due tomorrow. Mary hadn't been able to make the payment last month, and she had no way to cover this one. Her fingers trembled as she read the words again. It wasn't just the rent. It was everything. If she couldn't figure something out soon, they would be on the street. Diego had promised to help, but Mary knew that was an empty promise. He had been so distant lately, lost in his own frustration, his own failures. He was angry at himself, at the world, and maybe even at her. But Mary wasn't angry at him. She understood his pain. She understood that he didn't want to fail her or Stephanie. He didn't want to feel like he was dragging them down. But that was exactly how it felt, like they were all sinking, and the harder Diego tried, the deeper they went. Tears stung Mary's eyes, but she wiped them away quickly. She couldn't afford to cry. Not tonight. Not when there was so much left to do. She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts list. There were no options. No one she could turn to. No one who could offer real help. She was alone in this, just like every other night. Her finger hovered over a name, then hesitated. It was Gabriel's name. She had no reason to reach out to him, and no way to even begin explaining her situation. But the thought of him lingered in her mind, like an unanswered question. What if he could help? What if he, with all his wealth and influence, could do something? But it was pointless. The gulf between her and someone like Gabriel was too wide. He lived in a world she would never understand, a world where problems could be solved with money, where Christmas was about luxury, not survival. She put the phone back down on the nightstand. No, it wasn't an option. She would find another way. As the hours passed, Mary drifted into a restless sleep, only to wake to the sound of the door creaking open. Diego was home, but the air between them was thick with tension. He stood in the doorway, his face pale and his clothes disheveled. His eyes avoided hers. "Diego," Mary whispered, trying to sit up. Diego paused, his voice thick with alcohol. "I'm sorry. I should have been here earlier." Mary didn't know what to say. She could smell the alcohol on him, feel the weight of his failure in the way he moved. His eyes were hollow, defeated. He wasn't even looking at her. He was just there, existing in the same space, but not really present. "You're here now," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I can't keep doing this, Mary. I've tried. I really have." Diego's words were slurred, but the pain was clear in his eyes. Mary wanted to say something to reassure him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but she couldn't. She didn't believe it herself. How could she, when everything was falling apart, when their daughter was depending on them to make Christmas even a little bit special? How could she promise him it would be okay? Instead, she reached for his hand. He hesitated before he let her take it, his grip weak. "We'll figure it out," Mary said, her voice barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were fragile, too delicate to withstand the weight of the reality pressing down on them. But even as she said it, she knew she was lying. The next morning, Mary woke up early. Stephanie was still asleep, her small body curled up in the blankets. Mary brushed her hair out of her face, watching her daughter sleep. For a moment, the weight of everything faded, and she remembered what it felt like to have hope to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. She stood up quietly, trying not to wake Stephanie. She had to make a plan. She couldn't let her daughter see how much she was struggling. She wouldn't let Stephanie's innocence be taken away by the harshness of the world. Not yet. Mary stepped out into the cold morning air, the empty streets stretching out before her like a vast, silent desert. She didn't know where she was going or what she was going to do, but she couldn't stand still. She needed to do something. As she walked down the street, her mind raced with possibilities. Could she get another job? Could she borrow money from someone? She didn't have many options, but one thing was certain. She couldn't give up. Not when Stephanie was counting on her. And then, as she passed the same street corner where she had seen Gabriel yesterday, she saw him again. This time, he wasn't in a limo. He was standing outside his office building, his face set in the same cold, indifferent expression she had seen the day before. He was talking to someone, a group of people who looked like they were trying to pitch him something. For a split second, their eyes met. It was only a moment, but in that brief instant, Mary felt a connection, a silent understanding, like he could see the struggle in her eyes. But before she could even process what had happened, Gabriel turned away, lost in the conversation with his associates. Mary continued walking, her heart pounding in her chest. That brief moment, that fleeting exchange, lingered in her mind like a question she didn't have an answer for. Could someone like him, someone with so much, ever truly understand her world? Would he ever care enough to help? She didn't know, but as she continued on her path, the question stayed with her. The afternoon felt heavy, like the weight of the world was pressing down on Mary's chest. The city moved around her, people hurrying past, wrapped in their own busy lives, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was slipping through her fingers. The hope she had clung to for so long was starting to fade, and all that was left was the overwhelming reality of her situation. She had made her way to the local food pantry to pick up some supplies for the week. It was a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, but it helped. She wasn't sure how much longer she could stretch the little food she had at home, especially with Stephanie needing so much. But even with the pantry's help, it wasn't enough. As she walked out of the building, her arms laden with bags of food, her eyes caught sight of someone she had not expected to see. Gabriel. He was standing across the street, talking to a man in a dark suit, his hands animated as he spoke, completely unaware of the world around him. The cold wind seemed to intensify as Mary hesitated. She had no reason to approach him, no reason to get involved in his world, but the brief exchange they had shared earlier, the look, the connection, kept playing over in her mind. Gabriel's limousine was parked on the curb, ready to whisk him away to another meeting, another high-powered business deal, another place where people like Mary didn't exist. She turned away quickly, trying to push the thoughts aside, but something in her chest stopped her. It wasn't a feeling of desperation. It was something deeper, a quiet whisper that urged her to act. Maybe it was the exhaustion talking, or the frustration of never having anyone to turn to, but for the first time, she considered it. What if he could help? What if, just maybe, he could see her, not as another face in the crowd, but as someone who was struggling to make it through another day, another Christmas, without letting her daughter see the cracks in the facade. She took a breath, then another. Without thinking, she walked toward him, her steps quickening as she crossed the street. As she neared him, Gabriel's conversation tapered off, and he turned his head slightly, as if sensing someone nearby. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, her heart hammering in her chest. Gabriel's eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was silence between them, the noise of the city fading into the background. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before he nodded curtly, acknowledging her presence. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but distant, as if he were already preparing to move on with his day. But Mary wasn't sure if she was asking for help or just desperately trying to make her presence known. "I don't know why I'm here," she said, her voice faltering. I need help. My daughter, she deserves a Christmas. We're struggling, and I don't know who else to turn to." The words came out in a rush, raw and unrefined, as if the pressure of holding it all in for so long had finally broken through. She hadn't planned to say it all at once. She hadn't expected to speak to someone like him at all, But here she was, standing in front of a man who had everything and still, she thought, might not understand. Gabriel didn't respond immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, as if trying to gauge her sincerity or maybe just the reality of the situation. Mary's breath caught in her throat as the seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence. She wondered if she had made a mistake. What could a man like him possibly do for her? He was a businessman, a figurehead in a world that she could barely comprehend. "I'm sorry," she said, taking a step back. "I shouldn't have bothered you. I just thought." Gabriel's hand went to his pocket, and he pulled out a business card, handing it to her with a practiced grace. "I'm afraid I'm not in a position to offer personal assistance, but if you need resources, I can direct you to a foundation that might help. They work with families in situations like yours." Mary looked at the card, her fingers brushing against the sleek paper. She felt a small spark of hope, but it quickly faded as she read the name on it. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, unsure whether it was relief or disappointment that she was feeling. She turned to leave, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel that it wasn't enough. The foundation, the resources, those were all temporary fixes. She needed something more, something real. But what? That evening, when Mary returned home, Stephanie was waiting at the door, her face bright with excitement. "Mama, look," she said, holding out a small, hand-drawn card. "I made this for you. It's a Christmas card just for you." Mary smiled and knelt down to take the card, feeling the familiar warmth of her daughter's love. She hugged Stephanie tightly, a knot forming in her throat. Stephanie didn't know about the bills, about the worry, about the struggle. She just saw Christmas as a time for magic, for hope, for togetherness. "Thank you, sweetheart," Mary whispered, blinking back tears. "It's beautiful." Later, as she sat down with Stephanie to share the small dinner she had managed to put together, Mary's mind wandered back to Gabriel's words. A foundation, resources. Could that be the answer? It wasn't the miracle she had hoped for, but it might be a start. And maybe that was enough. For now. Stephanie looked up at her, her innocent face full of hope. "Mama, will we put up the tree tomorrow? Can we hang the ornaments? I can't wait to see what Santa brings us." Mary's heart twisted. Stephanie deserved so much more than this. More than what Mary could offer, more than what they had. But she couldn't let that hope die. "Not yet. We'll make it special," Mary promised, though she wasn't sure how. But as she said those words, deep down, she hoped that somehow, some way, things would change before Christmas morning arrived. Mary woke early the next morning, the bitter cold seeping through the thin walls of their apartment. Stephanie was still asleep, curled up in a ball on the couch, her face peaceful and innocent, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that gnawed at Mary's chest. As Mary quietly moved about the kitchen, making a simple breakfast, her mind couldn't shake the image of Gabriel handing her that business card the day before. A foundation, resources. The words echoed in her mind, tempting her with the possibility of a way out, but there was something about them that felt hollow. It wasn't the kind of help that could bring the magic back to her daughter's Christmas. It wasn't the kind of help that could fix the tension between her and Diego, or ease the crushing weight of the rent she still couldn't pay. But it was something. As she stirred the eggs in the pan, Mary stared at the card Gabriel had given her. It was simple, professional, a stark contrast to the life she led. The name of the foundation was printed neatly at the top, its logo a reminder that there were systems in place for people like her. People struggling, people desperate for a little help. She wasn't sure what it could offer, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sliver of hope. Stephanie's laughter broke through her thoughts. The little girl had woken up, and with her usual excitement, she ran to the kitchen, her bare feet pattering across the floor. "Mama, can we decorate the tree today? Please, please, please?" Stephanie's face lit up as she bounced in place, holding her arms up in an exaggerated plea. Mary smiled softly, despite the knot in her stomach. She nodded, setting the plate of eggs down on the table. "Yes, baby, we will. But first, we need to make sure we have everything for it. We need some more ornaments, okay?" Stephanie beamed. "I can help make more. We can use the glitter you have, and the beads from last year." Her enthusiasm was infectious, but it made the weight of Mary's own silence even harder to bear. "Yes, We'll use all the things we have, Mary replied, her voice tight. We'll make it work. As they ate breakfast, Mary's mind wandered back to Gabriel's offer. What was stopping her from calling the foundation? What was stopping her from at least trying? She knew it wasn't going to solve everything, but it was something, a first step. But the thought of reaching out, of admitting to someone, especially someone like Gabriel, that she couldn't provide for her daughter, made her stomach turn. What would he think of her? What would he think of the woman who was too proud to ask for help, now reduced to pleading for assistance just to make her child's Christmas special? Her thoughts were interrupted by Diego stumbling through the door, his face flushed and his eyes red. It was clear he had been drinking again, the faint scent of alcohol still lingering on him, despite the early hour. He didn't say anything as he sat down at the table, his eyes averted, his jaw tight with unspoken frustration. Mary couldn't help but feel the distance between them, the divide growing wider with each passing day. She had been waiting for him to do something, to take some kind of action to help them, but all he had done was retreat further into his own misery. The look on his face made it clear that he wasn't going to make Christmas any easier. Stephanie, oblivious to the tension, chattered on about the tree, asking Diego to help with the decorations once they were ready. Diego didn't respond, his eyes staring blankly at his coffee, his mind somewhere far away. Mary's heart broke a little more. She had tried to hold everything together, but now she was holding it all alone. And there was only so much she could do before everything came crashing down. She stood up abruptly. I need to go out for a bit. I'll be back soon. Diego barely looked up from his coffee. Where are you going? His voice was distant, as if he wasn't really asking, just making a statement. I need to take care of something, she said, her words sharp. I'll be back. Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her coat and stepped out into the cold morning air. As she walked down the street, she clutched Gabriel's business card in her pocket. Her hands were trembling, not from the cold, but from the uncertainty of what she was about to do. Mary found the building where the foundation was located in a part of the city that felt far removed from her reality. It was a sleek, modern structure with clean lines and glass windows that reflected the bustle of the city. The contrast between the polished exterior and the grime of the streets she had walked from was stark. She stood in front of the door for a moment, her mind racing with doubt. She had never been one to ask for help, not like this. She wasn't sure what she would say, or if they would even take her seriously. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and walked inside. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile, but there was a brief hesitation in her eyes when she saw Mary standing there, out of place in her worn coat and boots. How can I help you? The receptionist asked, her voice friendly but formal. Mary hesitated for a moment, the weight of the situation settling over her. She had never been good at asking for help, but today was different. Today, she had to try. For Stephanie. I was given this card. I need help. My daughter. She's expecting a Christmas, and I'm trying to make it work, but I don't know how much longer I can keep up. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. I just need something, anything, to make sure she has a little joy this year. The receptionist's expression softened. Of course, she said. Let me make some calls. We can help. Please have a seat. Mary's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of something. Relief, hope, maybe even a little bit of faith. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was something, and that something was all she needed to keep going. When Mary returned home, Stephanie was already at the window, staring out at the street, her eyes wide with anticipation. Mama, is it time for the tree? Mary smiled, her heart swelling. Yes, sweetheart, it's time. As she set to work on the tree with Stephanie, Diego lingered in the doorway, still distant but watching. For a moment, everything felt okay. Not perfect, but okay. Mary had found a way forward, however small. And for now, that was enough. The days leading up to Christmas felt like a blur for Mary. The foundation had reached out to her with more than she could have hoped for. Gifts for Stephanie, some food, and a promise of a Christmas dinner at a community center. It wasn't the grand holiday she had once imagined for her daughter, but it was something. For the first time in weeks, Mary felt the faintest glimmer of relief, as if the weight that had been crushing her chest had lessened. just a little. But despite the help, there was still something hanging over her. Diego. He hadn't been the same since the day she had gone to the foundation, and his distance was palpable. It wasn't just the alcohol anymore. It was the quiet resignation in his eyes, the way he seemed to have given up on everything, including her. The more Mary tried to keep their family together, the more he seemed to drift further away. The evening before Christmas Eve, Mary sat with Stephanie at the kitchen table, wrapping the few presents she had been able to afford, most of them simple things, but they would bring joy to her daughter. Stephanie had insisted on helping, even though she didn't fully understand why her mother was so quiet, why there was no festive music playing, no decorations filling every corner of their apartment. "Will Santa bring me the bike I asked for?" Stephanie asked, her voice full of innocent hope, as she carefully taped a corner of the wrapping paper. Mary paused, her hands faltering on the paper. She had promised herself she wouldn't lie to Stephanie, but the truth felt like it would shatter her little girl's heart. She wasn't sure how to tell Stephanie that the bike was a dream, one they simply couldn't afford, not with everything else piling up. Instead, Mary smiled and nodded. "I'm sure he will. Santa always knows what you want." Stephanie beamed at her, the joy in her face breaking Mary's heart all over again. She wanted to give her daughter everything: the bike, the Christmas tree filled with presents, the family gatherings that Stephanie saw in movies. But all Mary could offer her was this small, fragile hope, and even that felt like a lie. Later that night, as Mary tucked Stephanie into bed, the door to their apartment creaked open, and Diego stumbled in, his steps unsteady. He looked different, his face drawn and tired, his clothes wrinkled as if he hadn't taken care of himself in days. Mary stood at the door of Stephanie's room, watching him from the hallway, the words she had been holding back all week rising to her throat. "Diego," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on? Why won't you talk to me?" He didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and something else, something Mary couldn't quite place. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, almost too soft. "I don't know how to fix this, Mary. I don't know how to fix me. Or us." Mary felt a sharp pang in her chest. She had always been the one holding everything together, trying to make their lives work despite the odds. But she couldn't do it alone anymore. "You don't have to fix it all," she said quietly. "You just have to try. For Stephanie. For us." Diego's eyes flickered with something like shame, but he didn't speak. He just stood there, his gaze lowered, as if the weight of her words had struck him harder than anything else. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered, "I'll try. I don't know if I can, but I'll try." Mary nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of those words. She didn't know if it was enough, but she needed to believe it was. The morning of Christmas Eve arrived quietly. The world outside was covered in a blanket of snow, the soft flakes falling steadily from the sky, casting a peaceful glow over the streets. Inside, Mary made a small breakfast, the warmth of the apartment a sharp contrast to the cold world outside. Stephanie was already up, her excitement palpable as she ran to the window to look at the snow. "Look, Mama, it's a Christmas miracle," Stephanie shouted, her voice full of wonder as she pressed her hands against the glass. The snow came just in time. Mary smiled as she watched her daughter's excitement bubble over, but inside, she felt an ache. It wasn't the Christmas she had imagined for Stephanie, not by a long shot. There were no fancy presents, no family around the table. But there was love. There was always love. Diego came out of their bedroom, his eyes bleary, but his face a little softer. He walked to Stephanie and placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression conflicted. "Looks like the snow came to visit early," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Stephanie turned to him, her eyes wide with excitement. "Do you think Santa's sleigh will be able to land in the snow?" Diego gave her a weak smile, but Mary saw the hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't sure what to say, and she didn't know if he was speaking to their daughter or to himself. "I'm sure he'll find a way," he said finally, before turning his gaze to Mary. Mary nodded, but she couldn't hide the sadness that still lingered in her eyes. Later, as they prepared to head to the community center for the Christmas dinner, Mary's heart tightened. It wasn't the celebration she had dreamed of, but it was something. It was a reminder that there were people who cared, that there was still a chance for small miracles to happen, even if they weren't the ones she had imagined. When they arrived, the warmth of the room hit them like a wave. Volunteers were setting up tables, and the smell of food filled the air. It wasn't a grand feast, but it was enough. Stephanie's eyes lit up as she saw other children running around, laughing and playing. For a moment, it felt like everything might just be okay. Diego, though, remained quiet, standing off to the side as Mary and Stephanie mingled with the other families. It hurt to see him so distant, but she couldn't force him to open up. She could only hope that, somehow, he would find his way back. As they sat down to eat, Stephanie's small hand found Mary's, her fingers curling around hers tightly. "This is the best Christmas ever, Mama," Stephanie said, her voice full of wonder. Mary looked down at her daughter, her heart breaking. "It's pretty special, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it, to believe that despite everything, there was still love, still hope. And maybe that was all they needed. Christmas Day arrived like a quiet promise, soft, still, and full of a subtle anticipation that only comes when you've been waiting for something you can't quite name. Mary woke early, as she always did, and watched Stephanie sleep peacefully beside her, her breath soft and rhythmic, a child's innocence wrapped in the glow of a tree lit by the dim light of early morning. But that peace didn't last. Diego had been up long before her, and when he finally stumbled into the kitchen, Mary could see the hollow in his eyes. The thin thread of hope she had held on to, this fragile idea that maybe, just maybe, Christmas would bring some kind of healing, began to fray. The weight of their situation, the mounting tension between them, was becoming too much. She had known it would happen. She had known the facade would crack eventually. As she sipped her coffee, Diego stood in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat, his gaze distant. He hadn't touched the food Mary had left out for breakfast. Instead, he stared at the floor, his face shadowed with guilt and confusion. "I don't know what to do anymore, Mary," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought I could keep it together for you, for Stephanie, but I can't. I'm not who I used to be." Mary's chest tightened at his words. She had spent so long trying to pretend that everything was fine, that she was fine, that it was almost a relief to hear him admit what she had feared. He wasn't fine. They weren't fine, and no amount of pretending could change that. "We need to talk," Mary said, her voice steady but heavy with the weight of what she had been carrying alone. "We can't keep going like this. We can't keep avoiding the truth." Diego looked at her then, his eyes filled with something that could have been regret or fear. "Maybe both. I don't know what you want from me," he replied quietly. "I've been trying, but it feels like everything I do just makes it worse. I'm not enough for you, not for Stephanie. I've let you both down." Mary swallowed hard. Her heart ached for him, but also for herself. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one who held it all together. But there were cracks forming in her too, cracks she couldn't fill alone. "You don't have to be perfect, Diego," she said, her voice softening, though her words were still firm. "But you have to show up. For me. For Stephanie. We can't keep pretending nothing's wrong." The silence between them was thick. Mary could see the struggle in Diego's eyes, the internal battle playing out behind his gaze. But the truth was, she didn't know if he could fix what was broken between them. And, deep down, she wasn't sure he wanted to. The quiet was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Startled, both of them turned toward the sound. But before either could move, the door opened slowly, and Gabriel stepped inside. "Hello," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "I know this is a strange time to visit, but I wanted to check in. I wanted to see how you're doing." Mary's heart skipped a beat, and she looked at Diego, who didn't seem pleased by the sudden intrusion. Gabriel's presence felt like an uninvited shadow hanging over them, his perfect, polished exterior standing in stark contrast to the mess that was their life. Diego's hand clenched into a fist, and he shot a glance at Mary, his eyes betraying the tension in his face. "I didn't ask for your help," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for both of them to hear. Mary felt the tension in the air thicken as Gabriel gave Diego a measured look. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm brewing between the two men. "I'm not here to intrude, Diego," Gabriel said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But I wanted to offer something. I know you've been going through a lot. And maybe, I don't know, maybe I can help." Mary stiffened, but before she could speak, Diego cut in, his voice sharp. "Help? You don't get it. You think throwing money at a problem solves it? You think you could just waltz in here and fix everything? This isn't about money." Gabriel's gaze flickered to Mary before he answered. "It's not just about money," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "It's about giving people the opportunity to rebuild. That's why I reached out to you, Mary. I wanted to help in a way that might make a difference." The tension in the room was palpable. Mary could feel the conflicting emotions rising in her chest. Gratitude for Gabriel's offer, but also resentment for the way it all felt so out of place. She had been trying to hold on to what little she had, trying to make things work with Diego, trying to make Christmas special for Stephanie. And now this man, this stranger, was offering solutions in a way that felt too clean, too easy. But Diego wasn't hearing any of it. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched even tighter. "You don't understand what it's like, Gabriel. You don't know what it's like to lose yourself, to watch everything slip through your fingers and not be able to do anything about it." The rawness of his words hit Mary like a slap. Diego's pain, his sense of failure, was written all over his face. She had seen him like this before, broken, distant, but never so openly vulnerable. "I know," Gabriel replied, his tone measured but empathetic. "I can't know exactly what you're going through, but I do know what it's like to lose control. And I've learned that sometimes it takes accepting help from others to find your way back." Mary looked from Gabriel to Diego, her heart torn between the two men. The weight of their struggles, the distance between them, felt impossible to overcome. But maybe Gabriel was right. Maybe Diego needed to see that there was another way out of this. The slow path of healing that came with support, not just from family, but from people willing to step in and help rebuild the pieces. Diego met Gabriel's gaze, and for the first time, something in his eyes shifted. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "I don't know if I can fix anything," Diego muttered, his voice quieter now. "But maybe I'll try. For Stephanie." Mary held her breath as Gabriel nodded slowly, his face softening. "That's all anyone can ask for." The room was silent for a moment as the three of them stood there, each of them wrestling with their own emotions. For the first time in a long while, there was a small but significant shift in the air, an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, there was hope after all. As Gabriel left, Mary stood by the door, staring out at the snow-covered street. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that quiet moment, she felt something flicker in her chest, a fragile sense of possibility. For the first time, she wasn't carrying the weight of everything alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days following Christmas were a blur for Mary. The euphoria of the small victories, Stephanie's bright smile, Diego's reluctant acceptance of help, the sense that maybe there was a way out, slowly faded, leaving behind the harsh reality of their situation. Diego was still struggling. The distance between them had lessened, but it hadn't disappeared. He was trying, but his attempts often felt hollow, as if he wasn't entirely sure where to start, or even if he could start at all. Mary tried not to let her disappointment show. She had spent years supporting Diego, believing in him, even when he had given up on himself. But now, with Christmas behind them, she wondered if that belief was enough, or if, like so many times before, it would turn out to be a futile hope. She spent her days working extra hours at the diner, doing whatever she could to make ends meet. Stephanie was happy, unaware of the cracks forming in the adult world around her. She went to school, came home, and played with the few toys she had received for Christmas. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep her spirits high. One evening, as Mary arrived home after another long shift, she found Diego sitting in the dim light of the living room. His eyes were tired, but there was something different about him tonight, something less resigned. "I've been thinking," he began, without looking up, about what Gabriel said. Mary paused in the doorway, her heart skipping a beat. She had been so caught up in keeping things together for Stephanie that she hadn't given much thought to Gabriel's offer since that day. It had felt like a moment of clarity, of possibility. But now, as she stood before Diego, The weight of it all seemed like an insurmountable mountain. "Diego, you don't have to do this alone," Mary said softly, taking a step toward him. "Gabriel's offer. Maybe it could help. I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm just asking you to try." He looked up at her then, his eyes meeting hers, full of the raw vulnerability he had been hiding for so long. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, the kind that stretched so long it felt as though time had stopped. "I'm not sure I can fix what's broken," Diego said, his voice rough. "But I want to try. For you. For Stephanie." Mary's heart twisted in her chest. It was a fragile admission, one that felt both like a promise and an apology. She didn't know if it was enough, but at that moment, it was all she could ask for. "You don't have to fix everything," Mary whispered, moving closer to him. "Just start with today. That's all I need." Diego nodded, a flicker of something softer in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he seemed to be seeing her, not as a burden, not as someone to disappoint, but as his partner in this struggle. Mary had always believed that love, even in its most fragile state, was enough to hold them together. But it had never felt more uncertain than it did right now. "Maybe this is the first step," Diego said, almost to himself. He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight that had been sitting on his chest for far too long. Mary stayed silent, her thoughts heavy. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe in the possibility of a second chance, not just for Diego, but for all of them. But the truth was, they were still walking on a tightrope, one misstep away from falling. Later that night, as Mary lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that clung to her. She had given everything she had, her time, her energy, her love, and yet she wasn't sure if it was enough. She wasn't sure if Diego was truly ready to fight for their family, or if he would retreat again when things became too difficult. But what could she do? She had spent years waiting for him to change, for him to pull himself together, and for them to be a family again. And now, with the holidays behind them, she found herself at a crossroads. Could they rebuild their life together? Or was this the end of the road for them? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. "Mom, are you awake?" It was Stephanie, standing in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Mary sat up in bed, a smile tugging at her lips. "Of course, sweetheart. What's wrong?" Stephanie shuffled over to the bed and climbed in beside her. "I had a dream," she said, her voice full of wonder. "I dreamed that you, me, and Dad went to the park, and we had a picnic. And then we went ice skating, and it was snowing, and we laughed so much." Mary wrapped her arms around Stephanie, pulling her close. The warmth of her daughter's embrace felt like the anchor Mary so desperately needed in that moment. "That sounds like a beautiful dream," Mary said softly. "Maybe we can make it come true someday." Stephanie's eyes lit up. "Do you think so?" "I really want to do that with you." Mary kissed the top of her head, holding her even tighter. "I do, sweetheart. I think we'll make it happen." For a moment, everything outside of that room, the brokenness, the uncertainty, the questions disappeared. There was just Mary and Stephanie, together in the quiet safety of that small, humble room. And for that moment, it was enough. But as she held Stephanie, Mary knew that what they needed wasn't just dreams. It wasn't just the hope of a perfect day in the future. What they needed was a real change. A change that would come from both of them, from their willingness to face the truth of their struggles and confront the uncertainty of their future. And with that thought, Mary realized something else, something important. She couldn't do it alone anymore. Not in the way she had been carrying everything for so long. She needed Diego just as much as he needed her. If they were going to move forward, they had to do it together. No more pretending, no more hiding. Just the truth, however difficult it might be. As Stephanie's breathing evened out in her arms, Mary lay back against the pillow, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, they would take the next step, together. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid of what that would look like. For the first time, she believed in the possibility of a second chance. The days passed slowly, with the weight of Christmas still lingering, but no longer carrying the same promise. Mary and Diego had made small progress, but there was an undercurrent of tension in their interactions that neither of them could completely shake. Diego was trying, but his efforts often felt strained, as though he were walking a tightrope, constantly on the verge of falling. Mary knew this path wouldn't be easy. It never had been, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. She had to believe it was possible. It was a quiet morning when Gabriel showed up at their door again. Mary had been expecting him. After their last conversation, she knew that he wouldn't give up on offering help. His sincerity had been impossible to ignore. But this time, as she opened the door, she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach twist. There was a weight to him now, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. "Mary," Gabriel said softly, stepping inside. "We need to talk." She nodded and led him to the small living room, where Diego sat, trying to pretend he wasn't aware of Gabriel's presence. He was already on edge, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. "What's this about?" Diego asked, his voice tight. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," Gabriel began, his tone measured, but with an unmistakable urgency. "I know I offered help before, but after seeing where things stand, I think we need to take a more serious approach. It's not just about throwing money at problems. It's about long-term solutions, helping you rebuild your life, Diego, giving you a chance to get back on your feet." Diego clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists. "I don't need charity. I don't want to be some project you can check off your list." Gabriel didn't flinch, his calm demeanor unshaken. "I'm not here to make you feel less than. I'm here because I see potential in you, Diego. You're struggling, yes, but you're still capable of so much more. You just need the right opportunities to prove that to yourself." Diego's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Mary spoke up, her voice softer, but no less firm. "Diego, listen to him. This could be the opportunity you need. We can't keep going like we have been. We can't keep living in limbo, pretending things are okay when they're not. If you're willing to try, Gabriel has resources, connections that could really make a difference." Diego looked at her, his gaze filled with something like fear. Fear of failing, fear of being exposed for everything he wasn't, and maybe, just maybe, fear of succeeding and realizing he wasn't sure how to move forward from there. "Why should I trust him?" Diego asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary's heart ached at the question. She knew what he meant. Trust wasn't something that came easily for Diego. Not after everything he had been through, everything he had lost. "I trust him," Mary said quietly, meeting Diego's eyes. "Because I know that if we don't take a chance now, we'll lose everything. This isn't just about money. It's about rebuilding what's been broken between us, Diego. And that starts with being willing to accept help when it's offered." Gabriel's gaze shifted between them, taking in the quiet tension in the room. He didn't push, didn't argue. Instead, he simply waited, giving Diego the space he needed to make a decision. Diego's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Mary thought he might reject the offer entirely. But then, to her surprise, he stood up. His movements were slow, hesitant, but he didn't back down. "I'll try," Diego said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know if it'll be enough, but I'll try." A mix of relief and uncertainty washed over Mary. She had wanted him to take this step, but it was still so hard to believe that things could change. Yet, as she watched him, she realized that this was the beginning of something. Something fragile, something uncertain, but also something worth fighting for. Gabriel nodded, a look of approval crossing his face. "That's all I can ask for." The conversation lingered for a while longer, but by the time Gabriel left, there was an unspoken understanding in the air. The future was still unclear, but for the first time in a long time, they were all on the same page. Diego had taken the first step, and while it wasn't a guarantee that things would improve, it was the beginning of something new. Later that evening, Mary sat on the couch, Stephanie curled up beside her, her head resting on Mary's lap. Diego sat across from them, staring into the flickering light of the fire. He hadn't said much since Gabriel left, and Mary knew he was still processing everything. "Do you think it'll really work?" Mary asked quietly, breaking the silence. Diego didn't look up. "I don't know, but I can't keep going like I have been. I have to try. For you. For Stephanie." Mary's heart swelled with emotion. She had spent so long waiting for this moment, for Diego to finally take responsibility, to finally show up for their family in a way that mattered. And now that it was happening, She didn't know whether to feel relief or anxiety. "Maybe that's all we can do," she said softly. "Try. Every day. Just try." Stephanie stirred beside her, her small hand reaching up to touch Mary's face. "Mom, I know everything will be okay," she said with the simple certainty of a child. "Because you and Dad love each other. And we're a family. And families always stick together." Mary smiled, brushing her daughter's hair from her forehead. "You're right, sweetheart. We are a family, and we'll get through this together." But as she looked at Diego, she couldn't ignore the knot of worry in her chest. She wanted to believe Stephanie's words. She wanted to believe in a future where they were whole again, where they could heal together. But there were no guarantees, and the road ahead was still unclear. What mattered now, Mary realized, was that they had made the choice to fight. Even if they couldn't see the outcome, even if they didn't know what tomorrow would bring, they had decided to face it together. That was enough for today, and maybe, just maybe, it would be enough for tomorrow. The winter days were colder now, the nights longer. It was the week before New Year's, and Mary could feel the pressure of time weighing on her. The new year always felt like a threshold, a chance to turn the page, to start fresh. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were stuck in a cycle, always just on the edge of change, but never quite crossing over. Diego had kept his promise. He had started taking small steps to rebuild, seeking out work wherever he could find it. And he had begun making amends for the ways he had let their family down. But every step forward seemed to bring with it a dozen doubts, some from him, others from Mary. She didn't know if he was truly changing or if this was just another attempt that would eventually fall apart. She knew it was too early to tell. She knew it would take time, but the doubts still lingered, a silent companion in their home. That afternoon, as Mary was finishing a shift at the diner, her phone buzzed with a message from Diego. It was simple, just a few words, but it made her heart skip a beat. "I'm coming home. We need to talk." She felt a wave of anxiety rush over her, and for the briefest moment, she considered not looking at the message. What if it was bad news? What if he had changed his mind, or worse? What if he had made a mistake, taken a step backward? But she couldn't ignore it. She took a deep breath and typed back quickly, "I'll be waiting." She left the diner in a hurry, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived home, Stephanie was already there, sitting on the couch, playing with her toys. Mary kissed her on the forehead and sat down beside her, waiting. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door finally opened. Diego stood in the doorway, his face tired but resolute. He didn't say anything at first. He simply looked at Mary, then at Stephanie, as if measuring the distance between them all. The silence felt heavy, pregnant with expectation. "Diego," Mary said softly, her voice thick with the uncertainty that had been building inside her. "I've been thinking," Diego began, his voice quieter than usual. "About everything, about us, about what I've done and what I haven't done." Mary felt a lump form in her throat. "I know, Diego. I know you've been trying, but it's not just about trying anymore. We have to know that we can make it, together." He nodded slowly, looking down at his feet. "I want to believe that, but sometimes I don't know if I can give you what you need, what Stephanie needs. I don't know if I'm the man I need to be for this family." Mary's heart ached at the vulnerability in his words. It was the same fear she had seen in him for years. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough. It was a fear that had held him back, kept him in a cycle of self-doubt and regret. "Diego," Mary said, her voice trembling, "you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to show up, every day, and we'll figure it out together." There was a long pause. Then Diego stepped forward slowly, as if the weight of the moment was too much to bear. He dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything, for letting you down, for not being the man you needed me to be." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes as she reached out to touch his face. She didn't know what to say, how to make it all okay, how to make everything that had happened suddenly vanish. But in that moment, she didn't need to say anything. They had both been carrying this burden for so long, and now, for the first time, they were both ready to lay it down. "I'm sorry too," she whispered. "I've been afraid that if I trusted you again, I'd lose everything. He looked up at her then, his eyes full of tears, full of something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you haven't lost me, Diego said. You and Stephanie are everything to me, and I'll keep trying, every day. Mary's breath caught in her chest as she pulled him into an embrace, holding him as tightly as she could. She didn't know what the future would hold. She didn't know if they would ever be able to fix everything that had broken between them. But in that moment, she knew they were both willing to try, and that for now was enough. Stephanie came over, standing beside them, her small hand gently resting on Mary's arm. I knew you'd work it out, she said with a soft smile, her eyes wide with innocence. Because you love each other, and families always work things out, right? Mary looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with a tenderness she couldn't put into words. She smiled, brushing Stephanie's hair from her forehead. You're right, sweetheart. Families always work things out. And for the first time in a long time, Mary truly believed that they would. As the new year approached, they gathered around the dinner table, the flickering light of candles casting shadows on their faces. The house was small, the room humble, but it was filled with warmth, with the quiet understanding that they had come through something difficult together. It wasn't perfect. There would still be hard days, still moments of doubt and struggle. But they had each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was all they needed. And as they sat together, sharing the small but meaningful dinner, Mary realized that this Christmas had brought them something priceless. Hope. Not the kind of hope that comes from fairy tales or magic, but the kind that grows from deep within, from the willingness to fight for what matters. It was the hope of a new beginning, a hope that, despite everything, they could still find their way back to each other. Together, they had made it through the hardest of times, and maybe, just maybe, the future wasn't so uncertain after all. Because for once, they truly believed that they could face whatever came next. Together, as we reach the end of this story, we're reminded that even in the darkest times, love and hope can guide us toward healing. Sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, but with courage and a willingness to change, we can rebuild what's broken together. Now, think about your own life. Are you holding on to something that needs healing? Don't let the opportunity for change slip away. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes a single act of kindness can change everything. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with those who need hope, and leave a comment below. Tell us what touched you the most. And if you're ready to see more stories that inspire and transform, make sure to subscribe. Because just like Mary and Diego, we're all on this journey together.